Good afternoon, Congressman.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for your time and giving us some of your time.
Of course.
My first question is, breaking down structural barriers, including what you described as structural racism built into the core of the American system, is a priority you list on your campaign website. Could you explain and elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. So I think what this moment in our history has brought to the fore is what I think many have known for a long time, but that certainly is becoming more widespread, which is there are structural barriers that have been calcified in our system that prohibit and prevent all Americans from, one, being treated equally, but two, from being able to participate in an America that we aspire to be and that our founders claimed that we were, where we were all created equal. When you look at the impact of structural racism, when you look at the impact of not just historically from Jim Crow to segregation, but who is and is not included in the protections of the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the Fair Housing Act, or the first iterations of a GI Bill. When we see how local zoning laws impact access to economic opportunity. When we see that for Greater Boston, I know you're aware for the 2018 statistics, that the median net worth of a white household in Greater Boston was $247,000. But for a black household, it's $8. For a Dominican household, $0. When we see that Boston is now the third most gentrified city in the country, and you see that we've got the worst commute in the nation, because the people that actually power that city can't afford to live there. When we see the massive disparities on COVID infection, as you've seen here in Lynn, but we see in Lawrence and Lowell, or Lawrence and Chelsea, and Springfield. The fact that an African American woman is still 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than a white woman, and 70% more likely to die when you adjust for the social determinants of health. Take income and education out of it, she's still 70% more likely. And so what I think the only conclusion we can come to is that there are structural barriers that have been deliberately and intentionally put into our system that prevents all of our people from being able to access the economic opportunity that our country promises each of us. And if you believe that the role of government is to set the structures and the framework of society to allow for people to succeed, to achieve their dreams, and yet we have structures here that prevent that from taking place, then government's got to change.
Thank you.
Can you assess the federal response to date with COVID-19 stimulus aid to individuals as well as businesses?
Incomplete and inadequate, in short. So I think a couple big pieces here. Right? First off, when it comes to individuals and businesses, the House of Representatives, as you know, has passed now over roughly $7 trillion of support. Right, the $3 trillion, a couple early investments in healthcare and PPE, but the big one, the CARES Act, about $3 trillion, and the HEROES Act, $3 trillion. That last part, as you know, has not yet passed the Senate. The CARES Act, when it was passed back in the spring, was a critical shot in the arm for so many families, so many businesses, and our society to prevent massive economic catastrophe. And I think, on the whole, we can largely say that it was largely successful. However, I think it's also emblematic of one of the major challenges that has been exposed about the functioning of our government. I've spent the last several months, but certainly several weeks, traveling around our Commonwealth, now that I can travel around a little bit more than I could before. I've talked to small business owners across the state. I was on Bowdoin Street in Boston, we were in Grove Hall, we were out in Springfield on Monday. When I was on Bowdoin Street on Sunday, about 10 businesses in a row did not get access to the Paycheck Protection Program, didn't apply, didn't know how to, were denied, did not qualify. Congress has put forward literally $1 trillion of support for small businesses. But when you look at the unique challenges that particularly minority-owned businesses or very small businesses, bodegas, nail salons, barbershops, immigrant-owned businesses, the barriers that they confront in order to be able to actually access those programs are over and above what I think many policymakers understood. So we say, hey, many in Washington will say, we passed $1 trillion to support small businesses. Well, if small businesses don't get the benefit from it, you might as well not pass anything for them. And this is what I mean when I say that in order to have policy that is actually going to address the needs and concerns of our people, that policy needs to be informed by the people that it's going to benefit. And you need to have policymakers that understand the barriers that they are going to confront when gaining access to those benefits or those protections or provisions. And if you're not present in our communities, if you're not in conversation and dialogue and have a relationship with the communities that you represent, particularly those most in need of support, then you're not going to get it right. And I think what we've seen is that this is a lesson from Donald Trump's election to COVID response to the searing racial justice moments that we're experiencing, is that government hasn't gotten it right. And we're clearly not, because you've got people out in the streets that are begging for more assistance. And what we thought was good enough, what government thought might have been good enough, isn't. And so there's a lot more that still needs to be done for protection of families, ensuring that people aren't going to face eviction or foreclosure, that they're able to keep food on their plate, roof over their head, that those businesses are going to be able to continue to meet the needs of their employees, that our healthcare system is going to be able to function. And there's a lot more that needs. Schools are going to be able to reopen. Daycare, childcare centers. I got 2 little kids. Hard to go to work if you don't have somebody to care for a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. A lot more needs.
Congressman, you've been vocal about our immigration system.
Yes.
What is your proposal to fix our current immigration system?
A complete structural overhaul to our immigration system, and an immigration system that I think is reflective of our values, our lived reality, and the history of our country, which is, by any objective measure, a nation of immigrants, and a nation that is made stronger by the contribution that immigrants are able to make to this country when they are welcome. And look, I come at this, Carolina, mindful of my own family's history here. It is a proud immigrant story. My great-great-grandfather arrived in East Boston in a potato famine on a coffin ship with nothing, and was not exactly greeted here with open arms. And by the way, that potato famine, there was enough food grown in Ireland to feed every single person. It was taken and exported to mainland Europe. The population of Ireland still has not recovered. There are still fewer people today in Ireland than there was before that potato famine. You can find an Irish bar in every corner of the world. So it's interesting the way these things develop, right? But an entire nation fled. That story of natural disaster, coupled by literally government oppression, that forces people to flee to pursue a better life or safety for them and their families, is the story that we are also seeing take place on our borders today. It's the exact same one. It'll look a little different. It's the same story. And I'm proud of the contribution my family has made to this country. I think they've made a difference. But I also know that their story is not necessarily different from any other immigrant story in this country. So the part that is different is that we now have political leadership here that seeks to vilify the contribution that immigrants make, rather than celebrate it, and rather than strive to put in place a structure that says, how do we actually balance the contributions that immigrants can make? How do we channel that and maximize that, while making sure we meet our economic needs, we grow our economy, we meet the needs of our local population, and we meet the needs of the folks that want to come here. And we clearly can do that. There was an opportunity to do this back in 2013, shortly after I arrived in the House. You know this moment well. Obama administration proposal put forth by a Gang of 8, key senators in the House, key Democratic and Republican senators, that had a veto-proof majority, 69 votes support, that came to the House floor, or that came to the House. We had the votes to pass it. We had the Republican votes to pass it. And Speaker John Boehner wouldn't put it on the floor. And that story has then been retold over and over again, whether it comes to comprehensive immigration reform, TPS, DACA recipients, addressing even small aspects of some of the quotas. And until we have presidential leadership that will recognize the value of that contribution, we're not going to solve it. It is one of the reasons why not only have I been vocal about the needs for reform, but I've been down on the border multiple times. I've led a number, I was one of the first people to go down to this border after the family separation policy. I've traveled to the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. I've, no press, no cameras, no nothing. I was one of the first members of Congress to visit the one of the tender care facilities, the child care facilities that was actually taking care of the hundreds of babies that we separated in our government's name, that were moved to Bronx, New York. And why I will continue to keep up this advocacy. Because as a parent, how could you expect anything less? And as the son of immigrants, how could you not say we can make a contribution?
Congressman,
Sure.
what is your perspective on police reform and qualified immunity?
We need to have police reform and we need to end qualified immunity. And look, I was a proud co-sponsor of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that passed out of the House of Representatives. The first step in a police overhaul, an overhaul in the way in which we police in this country. That was led by the Congressional Black Caucus in the wake of Mr. Floyd's murder. And let's be clear about this, Mr. Jorgensen. That's where this has to start. That is not the end. That's got to be the start. We have to recognize that one of the reasons why I ran for office in the first place was I was at that point, my prior job, as you know, was in a prosecutor. And I saw every single day the way in which our nation criminalizes mental illness. The largest providers of mental health care in our country are the jails in LA and Chicago. You talk to the sheriffs across our state, as you know, the people that run our jails, they will tell you that on any given night, 80 to 90% of the incarcerated individuals suffer from substance use disorder or mental illness, or both. The number of times I was in a courtroom, and you had, at that point, young men and women, kids, not much younger than I was, that broke into 15 cars in a night, 4 or 5 homes over the course of the weekend, to satiate, to try to steal GPSs or literally pocket change, laptops, whatever else, to sell at a pawn shop, to buy a couple of Percocet or OxyContin, to get them through a couple days to satiate an opioid addiction, and then they'd have to do it again. And it would come to me, and now you got a kid that's charged with 15 felonies. And really what they need is treatment. And you see this over and over and over again. And so what have we done? We tell police, you got to go out there and essentially lock people up that are sick. Or that we send folks out for somebody that's struggling with mental illness, that's disassociated. They come into a court and be charged with disorderly conduct. The criminal penalty for disorderly conduct is a $100 fine. Trespass at McDonald's because you had somebody who was homeless and suffering mental illness that was looking for a French fry. Penalty was $100. Police would come in, you'd have the gentleman be arraigned, and I'd turn him and go, oh yeah, fine a homeless guy $100? And say, what do you want us to do? And everybody did this, and that person got that case dismissed with another entry on a board of probation record, and went right back out to where they were right before. Because we do not address mental behavioral illness, along with myriad other challenges that then fall back on our criminal justice. And so, overall, the policing is obviously critically important. But we also have to get to the structural aspects that lead, that because of a lack of investment and a lack of willingness to actually make that investment, leads to these challenges basically being put on police in our country.
Congressman, you are a proponent of ensuring early education access for every family. How would you help bring this to fruition?
Oh boy, great one. So this is a big one and a big deal. And I come at it from a couple of different reasons, but the biggest, well, one of them. Almost any study you look at will tell you that the best money government can spend is on early childcare. The return on investment, it doesn't just benefit that little boy or girl, it benefits that little boy or girls, their grandchildren. It is a multi-generational investment in our kids and in our future. One. Two. If you want parents to be able to go to work, you got to give them access to childcare. Massachusetts is one of 28 states in the country where the cost of early childcare from birth to 5, when you can go off to kindergarten, birth to 5, year on year, is more expensive than college tuition. Think about that for a second. You got 18 years and a tax incentive savings plan to save for one. You got 9 months to figure out the other. You got the median household income in Lynn is about $54,000 a year. The average statewide cost, average across the state, of early child care birth to 5 is 20 grand. You're making 55 grand a year household and you got 2 little kids. How are you supposed to pay for it? And we have families that can, families that are fortunate like mine that can. But then we say, you got a family that's going to have, both of my kids are December birthdays. Lucky us, right? So you get essentially an extra year. But you're going to have children that have essentially a couple extra years of early childcare before they go into kindergarten versus other families that don't. And then you're going to put that on a kindergarten teacher or on a public school teacher to say, hey, there's going to be a massive level of difference in terms of educational exposure by the time that child gets into your classroom. And we're going to expect a kindergarten teacher to be able to level that off. And by the way, 90% of brain development happens by age 5. 90%. So if it's the best money we could spend between a 9 to 1 and 13 to 1 ROI, between you get a multi-generational impact on that investment. You alleviate one of the biggest economic burdens that working families are facing. You finally update the structures of an economy, because for prior generations, the way that we did this was dad worked and mom took care of the kids. But the economy today, you guys all know this, it requires a 2-parent income in order to make rent or a mortgage. But we still say, figure out childcare. And that's at childcare payment rates, payments to providers that are massively exploitative of those providers who are largely women of color. The system is completely broken. And there's more than enough investment here from, and particularly given the return that we get, for government to actually make that investment and make it a public good, to looking at the opportunities for public-private partnerships or employer matching programs or whatever else to actually make this work so it is affordable, accessible, and available for everyone. And I know that because one of the entities that has some of the best childcare is the U.S. military. Why? Because they realized that mom or dad wasn't going to go deploy if you couldn't take care of their kids. And they didn't have a good one. And then, about 15 years ago, they renovated it and had participation based on a sliding scale, based on your ability to pay, with a huge backstop from taxpayers. Because if we're going to send mom or dad overseas to go fight a war, least we could do is tell you that we're going to take care of your kids. We can do this, and we need to. It's gone on far.
Congressman,
Yeah.
Latinx are the fastest growing minority in this country.
Yeah.
So what are the priorities about the issues that we currently are facing? What are the priorities that you would try to help and be a champion for the Latinx community?
So, Carolina, a couple things here that I think are really important. One, the issues that I think are structural for a Latinx community: economic development and economic opportunity, immigration reform, the setting the foundation to ensure that every family is going to be able to have access to that American dream, and so things like, again, early child care, educational opportunities, et cetera. Right? And I'm happy to get into detail on those as I think is important. But I think the biggest piece of this, Carolina, that still candidly, a Democratic Party, certainly a Republican Party, but still a Democratic Party hasn't gotten right, is the representation piece. It's Democrats you hear oftentimes from a party of, this is going to be the year of the Latino election, right? This is going to be the year that Hispanics make their voting presence felt. And we expect that it's going to happen and it's going to deliver a presidential election or turn Texas blue or purple or whatever else. You've heard this a million times. Democrats expect that, but aren't willing to make the concerted, deliberate, direct investment of time, effort, energy into a Latino community. In 2020, in this race, I was the first candidate for statewide office to actually hold town halls in Spanish in Latino communities. The first one in 2020 in Massachusetts. I'm proud of that. It shouldn't have been me. It just shouldn't have been me. The fact that I kicked off my campaign in East Boston, the fact that we have gone back over and over and over again to Lawrence and Springfield and East Boston, Lynn, and a number of other places. The fact that we've been really intentional and deliberate about not just the policies, but trying to do that outreach, those town halls in Spanish, and the Spanish that works, and it's with a very heavy Muy Dominicano accent, and so take it for what it's worth.
We'll take it.
Take it for what it's worth, right? But it's been at least an acknowledgement on my part that there are barriers there that exist between policymakers and our communities, particularly communities of color and communities where English is not necessarily first language. That if we want to represent, if policymakers want to represent them, you have to go that extra mile. Because otherwise it's essentially, largely historically, white guys trying to guess what's actually the best thing for Hispanic community. Which if you haven't spent much time there, and you don't speak the language, and you don't know the culture, how the heck are you going to know? And so, I don't profess to have all of the answers for what's best for our Latino community. I can tell you that at the very least, I know I don't know, but I've tried to show over the course of this campaign how I would try to mitigate that, which is you show up in a Latino community, and you give people the chance to acercarse, to approach you, to be available, to answer the questions, and you do it as best you can in, at the very least, a tongue that is more comfortable. And if you still can't do it, you get a guy next to you that can translate for you.
Absolutely.
And I think that part is critically important. Because even if I don't get all the policy right, I would hope there's at least an acknowledgement that of, as I referenced earlier, that disconnect between representation and representative, and that I'm doing everything I can try to break that disconnect down and to be as present as we possibly can be. And so I think that's kind of the biggest prerequisite that still exists. And then there's the issues below it, economic development, policies that celebrate family, policies that address immigration reform, as we discussed, schooling, early childhood education, that I think are super important. But you don't get those right if you don't cross that threshold first. Okay.
You describe yourself as a Green New Deal co-sponsor, and you say we must take on the structural inequalities and environmental impacts. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So the Green New Deal co-sponsor piece was, I was an original co-sponsor of the Green New Deal. I was on it when it was formally submitted to the Congress. The way in which I have, I'm proud of my environmental record. The way in which I've approached the impacts of climate change has been largely through an environmental justice lens, and working through as a representative for the 4th District of Congress, working through communities on the front line of that impact, right? And environmental justice, Fall River is a great example. City that shares an awful lot in common with old industrial manufacturing communities. Communities that are now on the front line of climate change, but with the right approach, investment, support, and overhaul, can help actually power that green energy future. And so what have I done there? One, work on so that's a bolts issues that I think are critically important to old industrial communities. like combined sewage overflow and stormwater runoff, and making sure that you've got aging infrastructure that does not, that aging infrastructure does not continue to not only cause massive amounts of pollution, but turn back on assessments of working class families and working class families in those communities that can't afford it. It means pulling together colleagues of mine from Congressman Keating to, I worked most closely on this with Congressman Cicilline in Rhode Island, recognizing the enormous potential for a green energy revolution off the coast of southeastern New England, and green jobs, and particularly offshore wind. And what this could mean, there were 2 coal-fired power plants in my district, in Fall River and Somerset. The opportunity to use that existing infrastructure as a connection point to the electric grid for the energy that can be generated by an offshore wind, the growth of an entirely new industry of offshore wind. The first project of which, the first one alone, is projected to create enough electricity to power 400,000 homes. And that's just the first one. That industry does not exist in the United States. Manufacturing, installation, maintenance, port overhaul, construction, infrastructure, all of that would have to come in to actually make this launching point from New Bedford to Fall River to Rhode Island to Connecticut. There's far more work that needs to be done than any one of those ports, even when renovated, can actually do. You can put thousands of people to work there for a long, long time actually doing this. And I've worked really hard over the course of the past several years, not only to help get communities like Fall River ready for it, but to take down some of those barriers that only policymakers pay attention to, because, you know what? To work on economic development in Fall River and not work on the biggest community 11 miles away because it's called Providence and there's an invisible border there that no one else pays attention to, but somehow we do, is a pretty dumb way to go about economic development. So pull in University of Rhode Island, pull in Congressman Cicilline, pull in Brown University, Rhode Island School of Design, the Naval Undersea Warfare Center, electric boat, and pull in the resources at the international airport in TF Green, pull in the resources that the region has to actually power economic development to help create an entire new industry. So that's one big piece to it. I've also offered legislation. So the Offshore Winds and Jobs Act with Congressman Keating to help fortify this, the Regional Economic Development Initiatives and a new regional commission with Congressman Cicilline, to Environmental Justice for All Act with the 2 environmental justice champions at Congress, Raul Grijalva and Don McKeechin, that finally puts environmental justice communities on the front lines of climate change, renovates and updates the Civil Rights Act to actually codifies this idea of cumulative impact, and my own bill that I offered, or that I drafted, called Voices for Environmental Justice, which enables environmental justice communities to get access to additional resources, technical resources, to be able to push back against the siting of solid waste disposal plants and chemical plants that otherwise could get sited back down in their backyard without their ability to push back. And so, taking a pretty comprehensive and aggressive approach on all aspects of this to try to make sure that, again, the voices on the front lines of these communities are the ones heard and the ones best positioned to actually help decide their own future with the support of the federal government.
Congressman, what would some of the differences be between you and Senator Markey?
There's a bunch of them, so thank you for asking. So look, Senator Markey and I have lined up similarly on a lot of things, but some big differences here. Senator Markey was against the integration of the Boston public schools when he came into office. Senator Markey voted for the 1994 crime bill that led to mass incarceration. He voted for the Iraq War. And I think those are, amongst other critical votes there, NAFTA, Patriot Act, those are critically important pieces, particularly for Senator Markey, where his argument is that he's running on his record. If you're running on your record, that's part of your record, and I think you need to answer for it. The biggest piece, though, is literally the way in which we define the job as being a United States Senator. Senator Markey's argument has essentially been, I voted the right way and I filed the right bill. I've been endorsed by this group. Because I voted the right way and filed the right bill, that's enough. And I wholeheartedly, respectfully, but wholeheartedly disagree with that limited idea of what it means to be a U.S. Senator. What it means to be a U.S. Senator, particularly at this moment, is that you acknowledge the fact that a U.S. Senator, particularly one from Massachusetts, has the platform and the ability to do good. And man, at this moment, there's an awful lot of good that needs to be done. And so roll up your sleeves and go fight for it. What does that mean? It means you're here. You are in Lynn, you are in Lawrence, you are in Lowell, you are in Springfield, you are in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, particularly for the communities that are on the front lines of environmental justice, on immigration reform, on racial and social justice, on the need for economic development and criminal justice reform, that you are there. And you are with them, hearing their concerns and fighting for them. Because if there's a lesson from this moment, again, it's that government ain't doing as well as we need it to be, particularly for those communities. And I don't think Senator Markey's done enough on that. Recent Globe investigation showed that he's here in Massachusetts up until this primary challenge about less than a week a month. And I don't think you can be a strong voice for your constituents if you are not here. You don't live here. Second, you got to be fighting for folks down in Washington and passing big legislation. Great. Senator Markey has missed, and since COVID-19 flared up in Massachusetts, Senator Markey has missed roughly 60% of the votes in Washington, D.C. At one of the most critical times in modern American history, he ain't there either. You're not here, you're not there. What else? You think we need change? Go out there and push for change. How do you do that? You go push a big idea, and then you campaign on it, and you support others, you build a movement, you support others that are going to believe in those things with you, on those values, to take over Congress and pass legislation. I was in nearly 20 states, when Republicans had the House, the Senate, and the presidency back in 2018. Right? And they were attacking an awful lot of the values that I hold personally and as a Democratic Party. I was in nearly 20 states campaigning for dozens of other candidates, from West Virginia to Indiana to Texas, and a whole bunch of others. Senator Markey was literally in zero, not one. If you are not here, and you are not fighting for us in Washington, and you are not out there fighting for the change that we need to drive to address those systemic reforms, then what are you doing? And sir, perhaps the most stinging indictment came to light last week, where a black mother and father came to the senator, asking him to help them seek justice for their murdered son, who was killed in New York by a white police officer. Literally, the exact issue that has risen to the fore in this moment. And in their words, Senator Markey did nothing. Did nothing to help that family. That family came to meet with me about that same time. I met with them. I pushed on a Justice Department down in D.C. and in New York City. We had calls with them. We advocated for them. We signed letters. I personally weighed in, phone calls. I brought them down as my guests to the State of the Union to elevate their case and their story and give them an additional way to give voice to what had happened. I've attended, they settled a multi-million-dollar lawsuit with the county. They used that to fund a foundation dedicated to underprivileged children. I've attended that benefit on multiple occasions. I'm still in touch with that family. I'm still working with them to try to open either the federal level or the state level to have that investigation reopened. Why? Because if you believe that the job of a representative at any level is to help, and two parents of a murdered young man come to you and ask for help, that's the very least what somebody should expect. And he didn't do that. So when people ask what the differences are, that's it. And I think at any moment, but at this moment, if you believe it is a critical time for our country, if you believe it's a critical time for our Commonwealth, and if you believe that a U.S. Senator can do something about it, why would we settle for somebody who's not giving everything he has, to fight for the people across our Commonwealth? Doesn't mean he's a bad guy. It doesn't mean he hasn't made a contribution. But it does mean that you should expect nothing less than everything. And I don't think that's happening.
So what is your greatest personal accomplishment and greatest accomplishment in Congress?
greatest personal accomplishment, and I hate to be cheesy about this, but it's just greatest personal accomplishment is convincing my wife to marry her and the 2 kids we have, who are awesome. They wake up every morning at this point, try to burn the house down, and many days are actually pretty effective. We've got a 4-year-old little girl who's already got plenty of strong opinions and lets mom and dad know them vociferously. We got a 2-year-old little boy who likes to inflict as much possible damage as he can every single day. And obviously love them both to death. It has been an interesting observation for me to see the development of this little girl and this little boy, and to wonder how the male gender still exists if natural selection is a thing. Because the number of times he tries to kill himself every day is actually fairly impressive. I don't think he's all that different than any other little boy. No offense to our gender. But so that, I mean, just, I don't campaign, I don't get to spend as much time with them as I'd like to. The odd moment of COVID is that I've spent more time with them over the course of the past 6 months than I ever have over the course of their lives. And one of the searing consequences of COVID. And what this moment is. With regards to professional accomplishment, look, I'm really proud of my advocacy on healthcare. From leading the fight to preserve the Affordable Care Act in Congress when the Trump administration targeted it, to continuing to lead the fight to expand Medicaid and fight back against the bureaucratic ways in which bureaucratic initiatives from the Trump administration to roll that back administratively, work requirements, Medicaid block grants, and to lead that effort back against the Trump administration. To have carved out the leadership that we talked about a little bit earlier on mental behavioral health care, where that comes to the committee I'm on, and I think most of my folks will tell you that I have become the leader on mental behavioral health reform in Congress. Filed roughly a dozen different bills addressing everything from Medicaid reimbursement rates to protection for pregnant women and young moms, to a structural overhaul in the way in which our country addresses and treats mental behavioral health care. And if there's a lesson from this moment, it is that our health is linked, your and mine. Right? There's a reason why we're 6 feet away. Right? I don't get you sick, you don't get me sick. But we're not going to be able to actually eradicate a virus, not only until I have confidence that my own health is safe, but that I have confidence that yours is too. And that fight is something that I will continue in Congress, there in the U.S. Senate. It's one that I've been proud to have led in the House. And it's one that I hope I have the opportunity to continue to deliver on. Should I win this election?
You talked about supporting communities of color, but women continue to have a huge disproportion in access to opportunities, reimbursement of their labor.
Yep.
How do you plan to address that gap?
So, a number of different levels, and obviously, again, Carolina, none of that is enough, right? The House of Representatives has passed the Paycheck Fairness Act, right, to try to address the structural inequity that comes to compensation for women, and then particularly women of color. We need this systemic change in order to finally deliver on that and sign it into law. 1, 2. You need to push here structurally and systematically, right? And I'll give you one example. I said 2 little kids. Off the House floor, it's called the Speaker's Lobby, and there's a bathroom there. It's the men's bathroom because there used to be women. When Speaker Pelosi became Speaker, all of a sudden there was a diaper changing table in that bathroom. Women in charge change things. Women representation on boards. Women representation in Congress. Women's representation in the executive suite. The examples on this are myriad, right? The reason why all of a sudden more people were dying in the initial design of seatbelts was because the engineers behind it all looked at themselves as models, and it was all men. They didn't actually test the seat for women. So what do we need to do? You need to understand, you need to have policymakers that are willing to, one, if you're a guy, admit the fact that you're not going to understand the structural ways in which women are challenged and disenfranchised. Promote that opportunity. Pass the legislation to try to level that playing field. And then recognize that even that's not going to be enough. And so be willing to listen and change your own policies, procedures as somebody in charge, as a member of Congress, as a boss of an office, to make sure that women are empowered. but then to also make sure we're looking at things, as we talked about childcare before, not just from the perspective of the child and of the parent, but the fact that the vast majority of childcare workers are women of color. So you can't have a model that continues to exploit women of color that are paid way below wages what they should get, and way below what, by the way, a daycare center pays a woman of color to teach that 4-year-old, where if she was a public school teacher, the salary would skyrocket because of 1 year age difference in that child. So what do you need to do? Look, it's a legislation side, but it's the elevation and promotion of women at almost every aspect of our society. It's making sure that you are an ally, an accomplice, and supporting those efforts, and ensuring that you're going to be there to support, sometimes even when that gets uncomfortable, which is what this moment I think calls for.